Our task today is to ask the question, what did Job learn about suffering in his life? The biblical book of Job is a history of a good man, but a good man beset with extreme suffering. Job was stripped, and that's the word used in the original, of his wealth, his family except for his wife, his goods, his servants, and his health. Job chapters 1 and 2. We then read that some supposed friends came to visit him after all those calamities, and their discussion with him was that he was suffering because of his sins. Job chapters 3 through 31. There are 3 rounds of discussions with his friends in the book, and at the end of those discussions, Job is confronted by a young man named Elihu, and there is a record of 4 speeches from that young man that changed nothing for what the friends were saying, that Job was suffering because of his sins. At chapter 33, we then read that God appeared on the scene, addressed Job, and at the end blessed him. Job chapters 33 through 42. The theme of Job seems to me to be the question as to why the innocent suffer. Mosaic or Jewish theology had never dealt with that question, did not deal with that question, but the patriarch is where we read about it. Job lived in the time of Abraham, or even before, and his record is the oldest biblical text. Job's name means something like, where is God? And if so, if that's the exact meaning, Job's name certainly fits the account of a man who is suffering but innocent of sin. In fact, Job wrote that he thought at the time that God had attacked him, Job 6:4. When we read the book of Job, we're reading an ancient poetic style of writing called wisdom. And this particular account begins in heaven, a thing that Job doesn't know occurred. We know it because we read chapters 1 and 2 of the book. And in that account in heaven, we read that Satan came to God and eventually challenged God's idea about Job. And Satan's idea was, Job only serves you because you bless him. God asked about that. And then permitted Satan, God did, to damage Job's health. But interestingly, the devil is told, do not slay Job, Job 2:6. When I read all of that, I learn an important fact. Job never accused God of an evil act, even though Job could not understand how it was that he lost everything. What I want to do here is re-examine the things that Job learned that we can read about in the text. We want to know what Job learned about God, what he learned about himself, what he learned about his friends, and what are the implications for us when humans suffer. We have to take into account another important point here, and that's the fact that since we know what happened and the blessings he got at the end, we think maybe this was just some kind of allegorical poem. No, this is an account of an actual historical man named Job. In fact, the characters in the book are named, and we know, of course, that God and Satan are real. As we get started in answering the question, what did Job learn about suffering in his life? Let's examine for just a moment the problem of evil in the world. The 3 friends of Job who visited him during his agony did their best, and they really didn't have a good argument, to tell Job the ancient principle that men experience evil, men experience suffering only because they are sinners. Of course, that did not help Job. And in fact, God said at the end, they have not spoken the thing that is right. as my servant Job has, Job 42:7. There have been many philosophical and secular reasons given concerning evil all through man's history. These arguments concerning the problem of evil and the existence of God have been expressed by the philosophers something like, if God were perfectly good, he could not tolerate the existence of violence and disease. Therefore, there must be some limit to his goodness, his abilities, and his mightiness. In fact, they're prone to argue if God does not have complete power over everything that happens, his failure to cure evil and disease must be because of the fact that he is not good, and therefore there is no God. Many terrified people, because of the helpless feelings that arise during some disaster or some violence of mankind, have lost faith in the goodness of God. Why did God allow this? All of these above concepts, every one of those philosophical arguments, my friends, ignores something very important, the free will of man. Man is the one who brought sin and trouble into the world, not God. Genesis 3. And the atheistic protests also ignore the perils of living in a dangerous environment. Whenever we read the book of Job, we should learn that all the characters believe that God exists. That's not a problem. They all believe that he's the supreme being. They all believe he's unquestionably justified in all of his acts. But every one of them thought, except for Job, that he was suffering and was being punished for his sins. Historically, the atheistic view is that evil is the antithesis of good, and that God created this world but left it alone to its own devices. And because of that, since the 1960s, in this country at least, there has been a God is dead movement. He just left it alone and then he died. But every character in the book of Job takes God seriously. No such nonsense that he's dead. Because they believed that this earth was his property. In fact, humans are pictured in the book of Job as God's special friends who can talk with God and God will answer them. Job was reluctant, because of knowing that, ever to charge God with evil. And so he postpones, Job does, any answers he might have about what happened until he, as he said, he could talk with God. So let's think about for just a moment, what did Job learn about himself from his suffering? The first test of his faith, Job chapter 1, 9 through 11, is about his wealth. He was said to be the greatest man of the one of the greatest men of the East, Job 1:3. This patriarch would have lived in a time when there were many terrorists in his area. But he's a man of integrity, blameless and upright, Job 1:5. In fact, he was trying to ensure, as the patriarch, as the priest of the clan, that his children were right with God, and so he made offerings for them. But almost immediately after making those offerings, Job loses his farm, his family, his fame. Job chapter 1, 13 through 19. Job's reaction to all of this is most telling. He arose, tore his mantle, shaved his head, fell down upon the ground, and worshiped, and said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord took away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job 1, 20 and 21. I learned something about Job there that maybe he did not learn about himself. but he was never going to charge God with an evil act. The second test of Job's faith is recorded for us in chapter 2. And we should note how fast Satan went to work this time, because he's bent on destroying Job. That is always the case with Satan. But God said, well, you can touch his health. So he lost his wealth, then his health, but never his life. Satan was not allowed to kill Job. And at that point, when Job is sitting, his body is black with some kind of terrible skin problem, perhaps boils, his friends arrive. We're never told how they became his friends, but the fact that they met by appointment shows me that they formerly knew each other. So they're not unacquainted with the other two, and certainly not unacquainted with Job. But they sit on the ground for a whole week and just stare at him, because he's so pitiable. He's black with some kind of terrible disease. They join him in his misery, in other words. What a strange situation. Now, in the text, 17 speeches will follow their sitting there with him, between Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. These are not debates. The friends simply talk to God about Job's sinfulness. Job, on the other hand, addresses God and then talks to his friends. He's not arguing a point, as were his friends. Job has the idea that he needs to understand his suffering. I think that's normal for human beings. When they're suffering, why? Life for Job has now become unbearable, intolerable, and death, he says, has become desirable. Job 3:11 through 21. In fact, he wrote he could not rest, he could not be settled because of his troubles, and what he feared the most had happened to him. Job 3:25. And then his friends come and just add to the pain. It's almost as if you went into a hospital room and said to the person in the room, I had a friend who had this disease, he died within a week. What a terrible thing these friends were saying to Job. All of your problems, Job, are because you are a sinner. One of the strongest tests of Job's faith came from Eliphaz. And Eliphaz sort of said, now, Job, God's your friend. Why don't you understand that what your friend is doing? That really hurt Job, Job 29:4. In fact, that speech by Eliphaz contained there in Job 28 brought to Job's mind the horrible thought that God was not only merely indifferent toward Job, but demonic toward Job, Job 7:21. What was Job learning about his friends? They had a wrong view of suffering. But to Job, all that mattered was God's friendship, Job 29:4. We have a living dialogue here between Job and his friends. It's Hebrew poetry, but not a debate. And the disagreements between Job and his friends are extensive. In fact, Job told them, my vexation outweighs any wrong behavior on my part. And I'm terrified of this suffering, Job 6:2 through 4. But if you read Job carefully, you will read a number of rhetorical questions from him. Here's the point. When a Jew used rhetorical questions, when Hebrew literature contained those, the writer or the speaker was pointing out how absurd the point was that his friends were making. He's disgusted with those friends, is what he's saying, because of those rhetorical questions. In fact, Job told them just right out, your words are tasteless food to me, Job 6:6 through 9. But in it all, even though his friends were disgusting to him, Job never ceased to insist that his suffering was not caused by sin. The last part of Job's speech in chapter 7 reminds me of the soliloquy of Hamlet, because it's almost like that. And Job speaks for a while about why it was that some of the patriarchs of his time ended up in poverty, ended up without self-respect, which was a common view of the ancients since they were wicked men. But Job said, I'm neither. You friends are wrong. I'm not being paid for my troubles. Job 7, 2 and 3. He tried to sleep, he could not sleep. He tried to think, but he was in physical pain and could not think very well. He couldn't rest. All he wanted to do was die, but he wanted to ask God why before he died. Job 7, 8 through 10. As the discussion with his friends continued, an interesting change in Job's thinking about them occurred. And you have to see that in the poetic parallelism of the text itself. Job is listening to his friends, and he begins to hate his condition because of what they were saying to him, not because he was a sinner. And you'll start reading statements by Job reminding God, God, you made me, but I'm still suffering. God, you may have had good intentions, Job 10, 8 through 13, but I'm still suffering. Maybe I am really wicked, aren't I, God? Or why don't you just slay me? Job 10, 14 through 17. In fact, Job came to the place where he said, why didn't you stop me at birth? Job 10, 18 through 22. One of Job's friends is so ineffective in his speeches, even telling Job he was no more than a donkey, Job 11, 4 and 12, that he told Job to repent, and then he doesn't even make a third speech. That harangue by Zophar had a strange effect on Job. It calmed him. Job chapters 13 and 14. And those speeches recorded there by Job are not as unintelligible as his first ones are. And that speech in Job 13 and 14 is next in length only to Job's last one. And so Job, listening to his friends, must have decided, I'll just calm down here. He's still angry, but he's becoming more faithful in his suffering. In fact, when you get to chapter 15 and you're reading about these discussions between Job and his friends, they become more severe toward him. They try to humiliate him with accusations. And then had the audacity to tell Job, you're injuring your friends right here, Job, because you won't admit that only the wicked suffer. Job 15, 17 through 35. Job hurled those taunts right back at them. And that's when Job came to the point, because of the harangues of his friends, God must be against me. But he will acquit me, he quickly added. Job 16 and 17. Bildad's last speech is a diatribe, just filled with accusations. And it brought Job to the point where he said, I know that my Goel lives. I know that I have a Redeemer kinsman. I know that my Redeemer lives, and he will stand in the latter day upon the earth. But Job doesn't have a Goel or Redeemer kinsman at this time. But his friends never helped him. And his devastation, Job's devastation, the accusations they made, just made Job feel, they've forsaken me. But he still and will never believe that God forsook him. In fact, at Job's last speech, his next to last speech, Job said of his friends' attacks, they're nothing more than warfare. Job 19, 7 through 12. I just mentioned the Goel, the Redeemer. What did Job learn about his Redeemer from all of this? He needed one. That's what he learned. He needed a Redeemer kinsman. He needed someone in heaven to argue his case, Job 19:25. Job wanted a permanent, written record of his innocence on a scroll or chiseled on a stone, Job 19:23 and 24. And he wanted to see God and spoke of the Redeemer who lived, Job 19:25. Therefore, the Redeemer who lived is deity, who would stand in the latter day upon the earth. That is a prediction of the coming of Jesus. Gesenius, in his Hebrew lexicon, noted that a Goel was one nearest of kin who would protect and free one from calamities. The Redeemer here is Christ, Gesenius adds, to page 150. We have a Goel now in heaven. My little children, these things write unto you that you sin not, but if any man sin, we have an advocate, a parakletos, a comforter with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous. 1 John 2:1. Satan had stood before God and made the accusation that the only reason Job was faithful was that God rewarded him, Job 1:9. Job was being pictured by the devil in saying that God was unrighteous to honor Job. The awesome news now is that if Satan tried the same tactic on a child of God in this dispensation, the Father would be able to say to the devil, take up the accusation with my child's advocate, Jesus. It is simply more than wonderful to know, and I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now is come salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ. For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night. Revelation 12:10. We have a lawyer in heaven, Christians do, who intercedes for us. A blessing not available to Job, but he still did not lose his faith in God, and he still hoped that God was his friend. I ask the question now, what did Job say to Elihu, who brought the same message to him that his friends had? After the end of the dialogues between Job, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, there are just three main speakers in the book: Job, Elihu, and God. Job's final speeches make up chapters 29 through 31. They are the essence of an innocent sufferer as he thinks about his situation. He wasn't talking to himself. He was talking about his relationship to God and his ties to his family that was now gone except for his wife. He's commiserating with himself. He reminded his hearers of how the community had recognized him at one time, how wonderful his life had been. But he did not know about that satanic challenge that had taken place in heaven. And he said, well, God did it. God took away and God gave. Only part of that is actually technically true. But the words of Job, Job 31:40, that's where you want to go if you want to know what he was thinking at the end of his suffering. He's speaking in a style that was known in ancient courtrooms. It's a negative confession in which the one would call down a curse on himself if he actually were guilty. But Job never addressed that negative confession to his friends. He was talking to God. Job 31:1 and 2. Job denied lusting, dishonesty, lack of integrity, sexual impurity, and added that he had followed a human ethic all of his life and could win any lawsuit set against him, Job 31:1 through 15. He also denied Bildad's charge that he was a miser, that is, Job was, that he was greedy or idolatrous. And then he ends up in that speech by wonder why I'm suffering. And while he's in the middle of that speech, Elihu interrupts him. Job chapters 32 through 37. I don't know when Elihu entered the scene, but I do know he heard the former discussions. Job 32:3. My concept of Elihu is that he's the final straw in the attacks on Job. In fact, he is the catalyst that causes Job to want to question God even more. Now, Elihu says, Job, you're fighting God. You claim you're completely sinless, then why are you suffering? And so his message doesn't change. Job had already told his friends, I will confess any transgressions if I have any. I think the illogicalness of Eli is best illustrated by his idea that since God can do no wrong, and that everything God does is right, then if God brought evil, it would be right. That wouldn't be right. James 1:13 through 15 teaches us in no uncertain terms that God never brings an evil on any man. Only good gifts, James 1:17. So Elihu's speeches form just one idea. Human wisdom is wrong about human suffering. Only God has the truth. And so we come to the point and ask the question, what did Job learn from God? It's interesting how God approached Job out of a whirlwind, Job 38:1. But what he says to Job is surprising to me because of the content and the style in which it's written. He is responding to Job's request to question him. But it is also amazing that Job never got to ask a question. In fact, he never could find out what the indictment was and what the specific charges he thought God had against him were. God simply said that Job had used words without knowledge. Job, you don't know what happened, Job 38:2. Now, when you read that, if you're just a casual student of the Old Testament, you're going to think that God's lengthy reply is there's nothing in it connected to Job's complaints. Because they had been discussing his torment and his suffering and his supposed sin. In fact, dear listener, the central issue of why Job had suffered so severely, when he had done everything humanly possible to maintain a good relationship with God, seems to be unanswered in this speech by God. Because all Job heard was a flood of questions from God. And we have to understand clearly what the function of those questions from God were and why God did it that way. They are rhetorical questions. And what God is saying to Job, you must keep searching. You must not give up on me. God was saying to Job that the only place one can get ready to meet God is in the very world I created. You can't meet me anywhere else and get right with me. This is the test area. The very fact that God did not give Job a list of some non-existent sins tells me what God was doing. Job, all you need to endure is to trust me, God is saying. And here is the great lesson Job learned, that everything was still right between him and God. God was still Job's friend. Well, why did God entrust Job with those trials? Why would God entrust any of us with trials? If I'm serving God, should not my life be easier? The problem is that we live in this world. This is the place where the test takes place. And the trial of our faith, when endured, works steadfastness. James 1, 2, and 3. And I do not know of a place in the Bible where it says God changed his strategy about this. I'm going to do it differently now because you're Christians. If you want to be used by God, it's not going to be easy. In fact, you're going to be persecuted. 2 Timothy 3:12. Because trials are a part of God's work, Hebrews 12:6. God is always in control. And if I cannot see how God is working, maybe I need to remember He's working for His glory, not mine. I do not need to worry about how things might work out, for God promised me eternal joy regardless, 1 Peter 1:3 and 4. And I also need to remember that these trials put God's power on display. Hebrews 13:5 and 6. Job learned that. God was still his friend, but God had the power to fix the situation. No one else did. And here's the interesting part. When God allows His children to be tried, He's still at the same time working for His glory. The ancient judge Gideon was taught this lesson when he brought 10,000 men to God to say, let's go fight the Midianites. God said, you don't need that many. You only need 300. Get a clay pitcher and a candle and a trumpet and take the 300 and defeat the Midianites. But it's to my glory. I wonder what Gideon thought. But you know, the moment that God's people showed the light, the enemy ran. Trials prepare me for God's service, Romans 5:3. Because God, in working for His glory, may allow the trial. Maybe it's a big trial. But the big trial gets me ready for all the little ones, Hebrews 10:32. When we remember the former days. I tell the students at Memphis School of Preaching all the time, look, you got through my first test, you can get through the next one. That's proved to you that you can get through it. In the fourth place, trials purify us as children of God. 2 Corinthians 12:10. I don't always handle trials well. I don't know how you're doing. But they often reveal what's really inside of me, my weaknesses. And I can work on them. I can get better. It's a vital part of my growth to go through these tests. Wars make generals, folks, and trials make Christians. Trials cause a Christian to depend even more on God, 2 Corinthians 12:9. Paul prayed 3 times for that thorn to be removed. God said, my grace is sufficient for thee. The greatest battle you will ever face in life is not so much outward as inward. When we have faith in God, we're not atheists. We may wonder why God allows the trial. But we're learning to be totally dependent on Him, 1 Corinthians 1:28 beginning. That kind of growth cannot occur for an unbeliever because he will blame God or what he thinks is God or some other thing. We are His children. And so we don't hate our trials. We just hold His hand and get through them. Because we learn from Job that all through his suffering, God was still his friend. There's something else trials can do for us, and the reason we're allowed to go through them, entrusted with them, we're showing the world our God's dependable. He takes care of us. Psalm 55:22, I write on every letter I send. I send it on emails a lot. But you place your burden on the Lord, for He cares for you. The world watches how Christians handle these trials, and we can teach the world about the God we serve. How can we have peace in the midst of all this suffering? We're holding God's hands, and the peace of God that passes all understanding keeps our hearts and minds. In Christ Jesus, Philippians 4:7. Having peace in the middle of a trial is a very unpopular worldview. It was unpopular with Job's friends. It's still unpopular with the world today. Trials show all of mankind that God is infinitely valuable. They are opportunities to be rewarded for our service, 1 Corinthians 15:58. In fact, it's just possible that when you're going through a trial, you're involved in spiritual warfare with the wicked in those high places spoken of in Ephesians 4:10-16. Satan is much like a dog on God's leash, but he's our enemy. But wait on the Lord and be of good courage, and He shall strengthen your heart. Wait on the Lord, I say, on the Lord. It's also possible that I'm going through the trial for disciplinary reasons from God, Hebrews 12:11, and so from Job I learn. Sometimes the world has the wrong answer to my suffering. Job's friends did. He became disgusted with them. And at the end, God said, Job, everything they said was wrong. Job 42:7. Job learned that maybe he did not know the answer to his suffering, but he did learn that God was still his friend. Maybe we can form the perspectives that Job had and learn that God entrusts his children with difficulties so that they may learn not to trust someone else except for him. I love God. And I believe that when all was restored to Job, except for his original children, and when the new daughters were named, something is being said to us, my friends. Job 42:13-15. When those folks in those days had girls, they weren't as grateful to God as they were when they had sons. But here in our text of Job, the daughters are named. That's a happy ending to Job's account. Job said, well, I was wrong about my view of my suffering. Job 42:1-8. And so he offered offerings for himself and his friends. He loved them in the end. He took care of them in the end. But that large number of animals Job offered tells us how sinful those friends' views were. And that their statement that only the wicked suffer is a grievous idea. Let us not be like the friends of Job and try to decide why something is happening to us. We don't need to know probably why. What we need to know is who's on our side. I'm innocent, Job said. Haley wrote, when he got to the end of Job, this: God has been so gracious to give us a panoramic view of the struggle that has been wrought in the heart of a man as he strove to harmonize his suffering and adversities with the goodness of God. The difference between Job and many who suffer is Job never quit. He had the victory of faith.